The ground trembled beneath the weight of thousands of armored knights, their banners snapping in the wind as two colossal armies faced each other across the fields of Grunwald. It was the 15th of July, 1410, and the fate of Eastern Europe hung in the balance. On one side stood the Polish-Lithuanian forces, united and determined. On the other, the Teutonic Knights, their white mantles emblazoned with black crosses, a symbol of holy war and unshakable power. This was no ordinary battle, it was a clash of empires, ideologies, and sheer will. And by the end of that brutal day, the Teutonic Order, once feared as an unstoppable force, would find its legend shattered. Who were these warrior monks, and how did they rise from humble beginnings to dominate vast swaths of Europe? The Teutonic Knights began as a small band of crusaders, dedicated to protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land, but their ambitions quickly grew. They carved out a sprawling state, ruled with an iron fist, and became masters of war, politics, and even trade. Their story is one of zeal and cunning, of faith twisted into conquest, and of an empire built on both piety and sheer brutality. Yet, for all their power, their downfall was just as dramatic as their rise. What forces brought these knights to their knees, and what secrets lie buried in the ruins of their fortress cities? This is a tale of holy wars and hidden betrayals, of grand castles rising from the wilderness, and of an order that dared to defy kings and popes alike. We'll walk the battlefields where their destiny was decided, uncover the strategies that made them unbeatable until suddenly they weren't, and explore the legacy they left behind. From the icy shores of the Baltic to the halls of power in Rome, the Teutonic Knights shaped history in ways few could have imagined. So ready yourself for a journey into the heart of medieval Europe, where faith, steel, and ambition collided, and where the echoes of their empire still whisper to us today. The story of the Teutonic Knights begins not on the battlefields of Prussia, but in the sweltering heat of the Holy Land. In the year 1190, during the brutal siege of Acre, a small group of German merchants and crusaders came together with a noble purpose: to tend to the wounded. They called themselves the Hospitallers of St. Mary of the Germans, setting up makeshift infirmaries in the shadow of war. At first, their mission was purely one of mercy, caring for the sick and dying pilgrims caught in the chaos of the Third Crusade. But the Holy Land was no place for passive charity. As the decades passed, the Order's role shifted dramatically, shaped by the relentless violence around them. Under the leadership of the shrewd and ambitious Hermann von Salza, these humble caretakers began to strap on swords. Von Salza recognized that in a land torn by holy war, healing hands needed steel to back them up. By 226, Pope Honorius III gave them his blessing, officially transforming them into a military order, the Teutonic Knights. Their black cross on white, mirroring their Hospitaller roots, now symbolized both salvation and conquest. Their first major test came not in Jerusalem, but in Transylvania, where King Andrew II of Hungary invited them to guard his frontier against nomadic raiders. The knights carved out a foothold in the Carpathian Mountains, building fortresses and imposing their own brand of order, but here, the cracks in their noble image began to show. Hungarian nobles grew suspicious of their growing power, accusing them of scheming to carve out their own kingdom. Within a decade, King Andrew expelled them, a bitter lesson that holy warriors were not always welcome guests. Yet this was only the beginning. The Teutonic Knights had tasted autonomy, and they would not easily surrender their ambitions. From the ashes of their Transylvanian failure, they turned their gaze northward toward lands where no king could easily uproot them. The Baltic wilderness, untamed and ripe for conversion, would become their new battleground, but that is a story for another day. For now, the once obscure Brotherhood of Healers had taken their first steps onto the stage of history, armed with papal decrees, German steel, and an unshakable belief in their divine mission. Whether they were truly protectors or conquerors in holy garb, well, that depended on who you asked. Duke Conrad of Masovia had a problem he couldn't solve with his own army. Pagan Prussian tribes' fierce, relentless warriors had been raiding his lands for years, burning villages and carrying off captives. He needed help, and he was willing to pay any price to get it. So in 226, he made a fateful offer to the Teutonic Knights: conquer Prussia in his name, and they could keep the land as their own. It was an invitation to war, wrapped in the guise of holy mission. The Knights, still smarting from their expulsion from Hungary, saw an opportunity too good to pass up. Prussia was a vast, untamed wilderness, no kings, no rival lords, just pagan tribes and dense forests, but there was a catch. Conrad's grant came with the approval of Emperor Frederick II, who issued the Golden Bull of Rimini, granting the order full sovereignty over any lands they conquered. With a stroke of a pen, the Teutonic Knights became more than warriors. They were now lords of a future kingdom, answerable to no one but the Pope. What followed was a campaign of fire and blood. The Prussian Crusade wasn't a single battle but a decades-long nightmare of sieges, massacres, and forced conversions. The Knights built castles as they advanced, each one a stepping stone deeper into pagan territory. Marienburg, Thorn, Königsberg, these fortress cities rose from the wilderness, symbols of a new order, but the Prussians didn't surrender quietly. Tribes like the Pomeranians and Warmians fought back with guerrilla raids, ambushes, and even full-scale revolts. The Knights responded with ruthless efficiency, burning villages, taking hostages, and erasing entire clans when necessary. This was the Drang nach Osten, the drive to the east, a holy war disguised as colonization. The Teutonic Order didn't just want to convert pagans, they sought to reshape the land itself. Germanic settlers poured in, clearing forests, draining swamps, and building towns under the Knights' protection. The wilderness became farmland, the pagan shrines replaced with churches, but beneath the surface, resentment simmered. The Prussians who survived were second-class citizens in their own homeland, forced to kneel before foreign lords who called themselves saviors. By the end of the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights ruled a vast monastic state, a realm where sword and cross were won. They minted coins, levied taxes, and even negotiated with kings as equals. But their greatest strength would also be their undoing. In their hunger for land and power, they had made enemies on all sides, pagan tribes still yearning for freedom, neighboring rulers wary of their expansion, and even the church, which began to question whether these warrior monks had lost their way. The very mission that built their empire would soon turn the world against them. The Teutonic Knights didn't just conquer Prussia, they built an empire in brick and mortar, their fortresses rising like crimson sentinels across the Baltic landscape. No castle embodied their might more than Marienburg, known today as Malbork. This sprawling complex wasn't just a stronghold, it was a statement. Built from millions of red bricks, its towers loomed over the Novgorod River, controlling the vital trade routes between the Baltic and Western Europe. Ships carrying amber, grain, and timber had no choice but to pass under the watchful eyes of the Knights, who taxed every cargo that moved through their domain. What made these castles unlike any others in Europe was their fusion of war and worship. Malbork's high castle housed a chapel with vaulted ceilings so grand they seemed to reach heaven itself, while its thick walls could withstand siege engines for months. The Knights didn't just build fortresses, they crafted sacred fortresses. Every arched window, every soaring tower, whispered the same message: God had ordained their rule, and their walls were as unshakable as divine will. But Malbork was just the crown jewel in a network of over 100 fortresses. Thorn, Königsberg, and Elbing formed an iron chain across Prussia, each castle a day's march from the next. Their design was brutally efficient concentric rings of walls, killing zones for archers, and wells deep enough to survive years of siege. The Knights didn't rely on natural defenses, they reshaped the land itself, digging moats and raising earthworks until the wilderness bowed to their will. Today, walking through Malbork's reconstructed halls, you can still feel the weight of their ambition. The Grand Master's palace, with its heated floors and stained glass, showed how warrior monks lived like kings. The Great Refectory, where hundreds of knights dined beneath flickering torches, proved their brotherhood wasn't just about prayer, it was about power. Even the bricks tell a story, fired from Baltic clay, each one was stamped with the mason's mark, a reminder that every inch of these walls was bought with someone's labor or someone's blood. These castles weren't just military bases, they were the beating heart of a state. From Malbork's scriptorium, the Grand Master issued laws that governed thousands. In its treasury he stored not just gold, but relics, fragments of saints' bones and splinters of the true cross, physical proof that God favored his warriors. And when rebels rose up, as they often did, the castles became instruments of terror. Prisoners whispered of dungeons where the only light came from the dying embers of interrogators' braziers. Yet for all their strength, these fortresses held a fatal flaw. The knights believed stone could silence dissent, that walls would make their rule eternal. They didn't foresee that empires built on conquest must always watch their backs, that one day, the very people they'd subjugated would unite against them. But that reckoning was still centuries away, for now the Red Castles stood unchallenged, their shadows stretching long over the lands they'd claimed in God's name. The Teutonic Knights' hunger for expansion didn't stop at Prussia. Their gaze turned northward, toward the fractured lands of Livonia, a region ripe with opportunity and danger. In 237, fate handed them a golden chance when the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, a smaller but equally zealous order, found themselves on the brink of annihilation. Crushed by pagan Lithuanian forces at the Battle of Saul, the surviving knights begged for salvation. The Teutonic Order, always ready to extend its influence, absorbed them in a merger that would reshape the Baltic forever. Now with Livonia under their banner, the knights pushed deeper into Estonia and Latvia, lands of dense forests and stubborn pagan tribes. This was the era of the Baltic Crusades, where conversion by the sword became the Order's trademark. But unlike Prussia, Livonia presented a new challenge. Rival Christian powers, the wealthy city-states of the Hanseatic League, eyed the region's trade routes, while the Orthodox rulers of Novgorod saw the knights advance as a direct threat. The clash with Novgorod would define this chapter. Prince Alexander Nevsky, a name that still echoes through history, emerged as the knights' most formidable foe. In 242, on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus, Nevsky's forces lured the Teutonic Knights into a trap. The ice cracked beneath the weight of their heavy cavalry, swallowing men and horses alike. The battle on the ice, as it came to be known, wasn't just a defeat, it was humiliation. Nevsky's victory shattered the myth of Teutonic invincibility, proving that even the mightiest order could fall to clever tactics and homegrown resolve. Yet the knights didn't retreat, they adapted. Livonia became a patchwork of control, with fortified outposts like Riga and Reval serving as hubs of commerce and coercion. The order learned to play the long game, leveraging trade privileges and political marriages to cement their rule. They even turned some former enemies into reluctant allies, offering protection to pagan chieftains who swore fealty. But the scars of Lake Peipus never fully healed. The knights' northern expansion stalled, their dreams of a unified Baltic Empire slipping through their fingers like melting ice. Alexander Nevsky's legend grew, while the Teutonic Order faced an uncomfortable truth: holy wars couldn't be won by faith alone. The Baltic would remain a land of uneasy borders, where faith, greed, and steel collided in an endless dance of power. And though the knights still stood tall in their crimson castles, the winds of change were beginning to howl. By the 14th century, the Teutonic Order had transformed from a band of warrior monks into something far more formidable, a sovereign state with its own laws, armies, and even its own foreign policy. This was no mere military order, it was a theocratic superstate, answering only to the Pope in name while ruling Prussia and Livonia with absolute authority. The Grand Master in Malbork wielded power akin to a king, his word echoing across lands stretching from the Vistula to the Gulf of Riga, and at the heart of this empire lay an ironclad economy that made them one of the wealthiest powers in Europe. Grain became their gold. The fertile plains of Prussia, tamed by generations of settlers, produced harvests so abundant that the knights controlled the lifeline of medieval trade. Ships laden with wheat and rye sailed down the Vistula to Gdansk, where Teutonic customs officials levied taxes that filled Malbork's coffers, but grain was just the beginning. The Baltic coast hid another treasure amber, the gold of the north. The order monopolized its extraction, polishing the sun-colored resin into jewelry that adorned the courts of kings and bishops from Paris to Constantinople. Diplomacy flowed as smoothly as trade. The knights weren't just conquerors, they were master negotiators, playing Europe's princes like chess pieces. They courted the Holy Roman Emperor with pledges of crusading zeal, while striking deals with the Hanseatic League to ensure their goods reached every market. Even bitter rivals like Poland found themselves forced into uneasy truces, unable to challenge the order's financial and military machine, yet beneath this glittering surface, cracks were forming. The very wealth that fueled their power also bred arrogance. Peasants groaned under heavy taxes, while Prussian nobles, technically Christian converts, still chafed under foreign rule. The Church, too, began to question whether the knights' holy mission had been corrupted by greed. When papal envoys arrived to investigate, they found a state more concerned with ledgers than salvation. The golden age of the Teutonic Order was a paradox, a time of unmatched prosperity built on foundations of iron control. Their castles gleamed with stolen relics, their granaries overflowed, and their influence stretched across continents. But empires grown too comfortable rarely see the storm clouds gathering, and soon those clouds would break. The summer of 1410 was about to rewrite history. For nearly 200 years, the Teutonic Knights had dominated the Baltic with an aura of invincibility until July 15th, when two suns allegedly rose over the fields of Tannenberg. This was no celestial miracle, it was an omen. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, clad in his finest armor, led his knights onto the battlefield with unshakable confidence. Against him stood a united Polish-Lithuanian force, a coalition of nations that had once been the Order's pawns. What followed wasn't just a battle, it was the unraveling of an empire. Von Jungingen's strategy relied on the same tactics that had crushed pagan armies for generations, a thunderous cavalry charge meant to shatter enemy lines. But this time the knights faced opponents who had learned from their mistakes. King Władysław Jagiello of Poland refused to engage immediately, forcing the Teutonic forces to bake under the blistering sun for hours. When the Lithuanians feigned a retreat, the knights' discipline cracked. Like a wave of steel, they chased what they thought was a fleeing enemy only to be lured into a swampy death trap where Polish reinforcements waited. The Grand Master's final moments were as brutal as they were symbolic. Surrounded by Polish knights, he was pulled from his horse and hacked to death, his body left in the mud like any common soldier. The sight of their leader's corpse shattered the Teutonic ranks. Panic spread as the Order's sacred banner, the very symbol of their divine mandate, tumbled into the dirt. By nightfall, the fields were strewn with 8,000 dead, including nearly every high-ranking commander. The survivors fled in disarray, their once proud brotherhood reduced to a bloodied remnant. Tannenberg exposed fatal flaws in the Teutonic machine. Their reliance on heavy cavalry, so effective against scattered tribes, became a liability against adaptable foes. The loss wasn't just military, it was psychological. For the first time, subjects across Prussia dared to whisper that maybe God had abandoned the knights. Rebellions flared in cities like Danzig, where burghers saw an opening to throw off the Order's yoke. Even the Hanseatic League, once a steadfast ally, began distancing itself from what now looked like a sinking ship. Yet the true tragedy lay in the aftermath. The Polish-Lithuanian forces, exhausted and lacking siege engines, failed to capitalize on their victory. Malbork's walls held firm, giving the Teutonic Order just enough breath to stagger on. But the myth of their invincibility was dead, buried alongside von Jungingen in an unmarked grave. From this day forward, every castle they held, every decree they issued, carried the faint stench of desperation. The tide had turned, and no amount of prayer or gold could wash away the stain of Tannenberg. Even the mightiest empires crumble from within, and the Teutonic Order was no exception. After Tannenberg, the Knights clung to power, but their grip grew weaker with each passing decade. The problem wasn't just external enemies, it was the rot festering inside their own realm. Prussian nobles and merchants, long treated as second-class subjects, began to question why they should bow to foreign monks who no longer seemed invincible. Heavy taxes squeezed the life out of thriving cities, while the order's officials grew fat on bribes and land grabs. Corruption, once unthinkable for a holy brotherhood, became as common as the Baltic frost. The breaking point came in 1454, when 53 Prussian cities and nobles formed the Prussian Confederation, a direct challenge to Teutonic rule. At its heart stood Danzig, a bustling port whose wealth had long filled the knights' coffers, but now its merchants whispered of freedom. They'd had enough of arbitrary arrests, of goods seized without cause, of decrees that favored German settlers over native Prussians. When the Confederation secretly appealed to Poland's King Casimir IV for help, the stage was set for rebellion. What followed was more than a revolt, it was a betrayal that cut deep. Hanseatic cities, once loyal trading partners, now turned their backs on the Knights. Lübeck and Bremen, whose ships had carried Teutonic grain to every corner of Europe, quietly diverted their wealth to support the rebels. Even within Malbork's walls, dissent simmered. Lower-ranking knights grumbled about leadership more concerned with luxury than spiritual duty, while Prussian conscripts deserted in droves. The 13 Years' War, sparked by the uprising, exposed the order's hollow core. Without the unquestioning obedience of their subjects, the knights struggled to field armies or fund campaigns. Their legendary discipline had eroded, replaced by mercenaries who fought for gold rather than God. When Polish forces finally breached Malbork's defenses in 1457, it wasn't just a military defeat, it was proof that an empire built on fear couldn't survive when the fear faded. Yet the most damning indictment came from an unlikely source, the Church itself. Papal investigators uncovered shocking abuses, Teutonic commanders living like kings, sacred relics sold to the highest bidder, even forced baptisms of pagans who were then taxed into destitution. The order's sacred mission had become a mask for greed, and Europe took notice. The very institution that once championed them now turned its back, leaving the knights isolated in their crumbling castles. This was the tragedy of the Teutonic decline, not just that they fell, but that they made enemies of the very people they were sworn to protect. Their greatest weakness wasn't Polish swords or Lithuanian bows, but the rot within their own ranks. A brotherhood founded to serve God had become a machine of oppression, and in the end, even God seemed to withdraw his favor. The Prussian Confederation's victory didn't just strip away lands, it shattered the myth that the knights were untouchable. From this moment forward, their fate was sealed. They would rule, but never again as masters of their own destiny. The 13 Years' War wasn't just a conflict, it was a reckoning. For decades, the Teutonic Knights had ruled Prussia with an iron fist, but by the mid-15th century, their subjects had reached a breaking point. The Prussian Confederation's rebellion in 1454 wasn't a spontaneous uprising, it was the culmination of generations of resentment. Cities like Danzig and Elbing, weary of heavy taxes and arbitrary justice, openly defied their monastic overlords, rallying under a single demand: autonomy. And they found a powerful ally in Poland's King Casimir IV, who saw an opportunity to dismantle his old rival's dominance once and for all. What followed was a war unlike any the knights had faced. This wasn't a clash of armies on open fields, but a grinding struggle for survival. The Confederation's forces, bolstered by Polish troops and Hanseatic gold, seized control of key strongholds with startling speed. Thorn fell first, its gates thrown open by citizens who'd secretly plotted for months. Marienburg, the Order's mighty capital, became a besieged island in a sea of rebellion. For the first time, the Knights weren't fighting pagans or foreign kings, they were fighting their own people. The conflict dragged on for 13 brutal years, a testament to the Order's dwindling resources and fading prestige. Without the unquestioning loyalty of their subjects, the Knights struggled to fund their campaigns, mercenaries demanded pay up front, and when coffers ran dry, they deserted. Even the Order's legendary discipline frayed. Chronicles tell of knights pilfering church silver to buy supplies, a far cry from the pious warriors of old. Meanwhile, Polish forces employed devastating new tactics, leveraging gunpowder and artillery to reduce Teutonic castles to rubble. The age of sword and shield was ending, and the Knights were painfully slow to adapt. By 1466, the outcome was inevitable. The second piece of thorn didn't just end the war, it shattered the Teutonic state. Prussia was split in two. Western Prussia, including Danzig and Thorn, became a Polish fief, while the Knights retained only the eastern rump of their once great domain. Even there, their power was neutered. The Grand Master now had to swear fealty to the Polish crown, a humiliation that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. The Order's wealth was stripped away, their trade routes severed, and their reputation in tatters, but the true shock came in the war's aftermath. The Knights' defeat exposed a deeper crisis, their very purpose had vanished. With Prussia slipping from their grasp and the Church's enthusiasm for holy wars waning, what role remained for warrior monks? Some within the Order clung to the old ways, dreaming of a revival. Others, like Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, saw the writing on the wall. In 1525, he would make a decision that stunned Europe, abandoning the white mantle of the Teutonic Knights to embrace Lutheranism and transform their remaining lands into a secular duchy. The age of the Crusader was over, but the legacy of their ambition would linger in the stones of every fortress they'd built, and in the borders of a Prussia they could no longer call their own. The winds of change sweeping across Europe in the early 16th century carried more than just the scent of rebellion. They carried the words of a defiant monk named Martin Luther. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door in 1517, he didn't just challenge the Catholic Church, he unwittingly struck a death blow to the Teutonic Knights' very reason for existence. For 3 centuries, the Order had justified its wars and wealth as God's will, but now as Lutheran ideas spread like wildfire through Prussia, their holy mission began to look like hollow hypocrisy. The crisis came to a head under Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a man trapped between crumbling tradition and inevitable change. By 1525, Prussia was a tinderbox. Lutheran preachers drew crowds in city squares, while Prussian nobles whispered that the Knights' vows of poverty and chastity were now theater. Albert, to his credit, saw the truth. The Order's religious legitimacy had evaporated overnight. In a move that shocked Christendom, he did the unthinkable. He met with King Sigismund of Poland, knelt before him as a vassal, and tore off his white mantle for good. The man who had been Grand Master became Duke Albert, ruler of a new, secular Prussia, one where Lutheranism replaced crusading zeal. This wasn't just a political maneuver, it was an admission that the age of holy warriors was over. The church that had once blessed the knights' swords now splintered into factions, leaving no pope to grant them divine authority. The Prussian people, long forced into Catholic conformity, embraced Luther's promise that every man could be his own priest. For the knights still clinging to the old ways, the betrayal was unbearable. Some fled to Germany, where a rump Teutonic order lingered as a shadow of its former self. Others, pragmatic or desperate, followed Albert's lead, trading their crosses for courtly titles. The secularization of Prussia marked more than the end of a military order. It revealed a fundamental truth about power. Empires built on unquestioned faith can only last as long as the faith itself remains unshaken. Once Luther's ideas took root, the knights' entire identity, warriors chosen by God to rule, became unsustainable. Their castles still stood, their land still produced grain, but without the myth of divine right, they were just another noble house scrambling for relevance in a changing world. The Teutonic Knights had survived battles, revolts, and even the catastrophe of Tannenberg, but in the end, it wasn't steel that destroyed them. It was a simple question: if God spoke to every man directly, who needed warrior monks at all? The Baltic had always been a battleground, but by 1558, Livonia became the crumbling stage for the Teutonic Order's final act. The Livonian War didn't just pit nation against nation, it was a three-way vise, with Ivan the Terrible's Muscovite hordes sweeping in from the east, Sweden's disciplined armies pressing from the north, and Poland's hungry nobles circling from the south. Caught in the middle, the Teutonic Knights found their once feared order reduced to a pawn in someone else's war. Ivan's invasion was the spark. His forces, armed with modern artillery and a thirst for warm water ports, tore through Livonia like a scythe. Narva fell first, its walls smashed by cannon fire, followed by Dorpat, where centuries of Teutonic rule ended in a single bloody siege. The knights, still clinging to medieval tactics, were woefully unprepared for Ivan's brutal new warfare. Their castles, designed to withstand arrows and trebuchets, crumbled under sustained bombardments. Worse yet, the local Livonian population, long oppressed by the Order's heavy hand, often greeted the invaders as liberators rather than defenders. As the war ground on, the knights' alliances unraveled. Sweden's King Eric XIV saw an opportunity to carve up Livonia for himself, while Poland's Sigismund Augustus demanded fealty in exchange for protection. The Order, once a sovereign power, now scrambled to pick the least disastrous patron. By 1560, their territory had fractured into a patchwork of occupied zones and rebel strongholds. The Grand Master in Riga became little more than a figurehead, his authority ignored by mercenary captains and scheming nobles alike. Enter Gotthard Kettler, the last man to hold the title of Master of the Livonian Order. A pragmatist in a time of chaos, Kettler recognized the inevitable. In 1561, he made a decision that would have been heresy a generation earlier. He renounced Catholicism, embraced Lutheranism, and dissolved the Teutonic Order in Livonia. With a stroke of his pen, 8 centuries of crusading tradition ended not with a clash of swords, but with a diplomatic surrender. In its place, Kettler forged the Duchy of Kurland and Semigalia, a tiny Lutheran state under Polish protection. The irony was crushing. The order that had once carved out an empire through holy war now survived only by abandoning its very identity. Kettler's conversion wasn't just spiritual, it was political theater, a signal to Europe that the age of militant monasticism was over. The knights' lands were partitioned between Sweden, Poland, and Russia, their fortresses repurposed by new masters. Even their name faded, surviving only as a historical footnote in the treaties that redrew the Baltic map. Yet the Livonian collapse revealed a deeper truth. The Teutonic Order hadn't just been defeated by superior armies, it had been rendered obsolete. In a Europe now dominated by nation-states and gunpowder empires, there was no room for warrior monks whose authority came from medieval papal bulls. Kettler's desperate reinvention was the only way forward, but it came at a cost. The knights' legacy in Livonia didn't vanish, it was simply absorbed, their castles now housing Swedish garrisons, their churches echoing with Lutheran hymns. The cross and sword had finally parted ways, and nothing would ever be the same. With their Baltic empire shattered, the Teutonic Knights faced an existential crossroads: adapt or vanish. Their retreat to the heart of Europe might have marked the end of their story, but instead it became an unexpected rebirth. In the rolling hills of southern Austria, far from the frozen battlefields of Livonia, the order found an unlikely sanctuary. The Habsburg emperors, ever eager to cultivate ties with ancient institutions, granted them lands around Linz and Friesach. Here, the knights traded swords for plowshares, transforming from conquerors into caretakers. Their new mission, not crusades but charity, a radical reinvention for a brotherhood once feared as Europe's most ruthless holy warriors, Vienna became their spiritual anchor. The Deutschordenschaus, their headquarters since the 18th century, stands unassumingly on Singerstrasse, a far cry from Malbork's soaring battlements. Inside its unmarked doors, the Order's modern identity comes into focus. Portraits of past Grand Masters line the halls, their stern faces a reminder of lost glories, while downstairs, volunteers pack medical supplies for missions in Eastern Europe. This is the Teutonic Order today, part medieval relic, part humanitarian NGO. Their once sacred military vows have softened into commitments to feed the hungry and heal the sick, yet traces of their aristocratic past linger in the ceremonial swords still worn at high masses. What's most striking is how tightly they've clung to tradition while shedding their violent legacy. The order remains exclusively Catholic and male, its members drawn from noble families, a requirement that mirrors their medieval hierarchy. When the current Grand Master, Bruno Platter, dons the white mantle embroidered with the black cross, he's not channeling the spirit of von Salza or von Jungingen, but rather the humility of those earliest Hospitallers in Acre. Their annual ceremonies, like the solemn investiture of new knights in Vienna's Deutschordenskirche, feel more like benedictions than musters for war. Yet history's shadow never fully fades. The Order's archives, hidden beneath their Vienna compound, hold chilling reminders of their past land grants stamped with the bloodied seals of conquered Prussian tribes, ledgers tallying amber revenues that built Malbork's walls. These artifacts sit uneasily alongside records of modern pediatric hospitals they fund in Slovenia or disaster relief sent to Croatia. It's as if the knights are forever caught between atonement and nostalgia, their identity split between what they were and what they've chosen to become. Perhaps their greatest legacy lies in this very contradiction. Once the shock troops of Christendom, they now epitomize the Catholic Church's shift from coercion to compassion. Their survival wasn't guaranteed. Other military orders like the Templars vanished entirely, but by embracing change without erasing their past, they've achieved something rare. The Teutonic Knights no longer rule lands or command armies, but in quiet corners of Europe, their black cross still symbolizes service rather than conquest. For an institution born in the fires of holy war, that may be the most unexpected victory of all. The Black Cross of the Teutonic Knights had survived centuries of warfare only to be hijacked by the 20th century's most terrifying regime. Hitler and his propagandists didn't just admire the medieval order, they weaponized its imagery, twisting history to serve a monstrous new ideology. Take the Iron Cross, Prussia's iconic military decoration since the Napoleonic Wars. By renaming it the Knight's Cross and adorning it with Teutonic motifs, the Nazis fabricated a direct lineage between their racist empire and the medieval Crusaders. The message was deliberate. Just as the Knights had civilized the East, so too would the Third Reich. This myth-making reached its peak in Heinrich Himmler's fantasies. The SS chief saw himself as a reincarnation of the Teutonic Grandmasters, even converting Wewelsburg Castle into a shrine where Nazi officers would literally sit at a round table like Arthurian knights. Himmler's obsession wasn't just pageantry, it was psychological warfare. By framing the invasion of Poland as a new Drang nach Osten, the Nazis recast genocide as destiny. SS recruitment posters showed gleaming knights on horseback, their silhouettes mirroring Nazi troop transports rolling into Warsaw. The historical truth that the real Teutonic Order had relied on diplomacy as much as violence was erased in favor of a simplified, brutal legend. Yet the cruelest irony lies in how thoroughly the Nazis misunderstood their supposed forebears. The Teutonic Knights weren't ethnic purists, Their ranks included French, Italian, and even Slavic members. Their crusades targeted paganism, not races, an inconvenient fact glossed over by Nazi historians. Even the order's famous brutality had limits. Chroniclers recorded instances where the Knights negotiated truces with Prussian leaders, while Nazi Germany offered only annihilation. The appropriation wasn't just inaccurate, it revealed the regime's desperate need for ancient validation. After the war, the damage lingered. For decades, historians struggled to separate the real Teutonic legacy from its Nazi caricature. In Poland and Lithuania, where memories of Nazi atrocities were raw, the Knights became unfairly conflated with 20th-century fascism. Only recently has scholarship peeled back these layers, revealing an order far more complex than either medieval chronicles or Nazi propaganda claimed. The lesson is stark: when history becomes a weapon, the past never stays buried, it only waits for the next distortion. The Teutonic Knights didn't just win battles, they perfected the art of holy war. Their signature tactic was the Schwerpunkt, the crushing blow delivered by their elite heavy cavalry. Picture this: a wedge of steel-clad warriors, their lances lowered in perfect unison, thundering across the field like a battering ram made of men and horses. This wasn't random chaos, it was precise brutality. Each charge was timed to hit enemy lines at the weakest point, often after crossbow volleys had shattered morale. The Knights trained relentlessly for this moment, horse and rider moving as one, their momentum calculated to snap formations like kindling. Against the scattered tribal armies of pagan Prussia, the effect was devastating. But cavalry alone didn't secure their victories. The order's true genius lay in combined arms. Behind every charge stood rows of crossbowmen, their weapons spanning an era of technological revolution. These weren't simple hunters, they were professional soldiers recruited from Germany's cities, capable of firing 6 bolts a minute with terrifying accuracy. At battles like Rudau in 1370, they turned the tide by raining death on Lithuanian horsemen before the Knights even engaged. The crossbow's piercing power neutralized lighter armored foes, creating kill zones where the enemy advance stalled under a hail of iron-tipped projectiles. Logistics won their wars as much as lances did. The Knights built their campaigns around fortress networks, each castle a day's march from the next. This wasn't just about defense, it was about control. From Malbork storied halls to remote outposts like Bartenstein, these strongholds allowed them to project power deep into hostile territory. Supply trains moved along protected routes, ensuring fresh troops and provisions reached the front lines even in winter. When revolts flared up, the fortresses became choke points, forcing rebels to waste months on sieges while Teutonic reinforcements gathered. Contrast this with the pagan tactics they faced. Lithuanian and Prussian warriors relied on speed and deception, ambushing supply columns, vanishing into forests, and melting away before the Knights could deploy their heavy formations. Their knowledge of the land made them ghosts, striking where least expected. At the Battle of Saul in 1236, these guerrilla tactics nearly annihilated the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. But the Teutonic Order adapted. They recruited native light cavalry as scouts, turned rivers into highways for rapid movement, and used their fortresses as anchors to deny the enemy sanctuary. The ultimate irony: the Knights' greatest strength, their rigid discipline, became their fatal flaw when facing adaptable foes. At Grunwald in 1410, their meticulously planned charges collapsed against Polish-Lithuanian feints and counterattacks. Like a hammer that only knows how to strike straight, they faltered when the anvil moved. Yet for 2 centuries, their blend of steel, strategy, and stone had made them the masters of Baltic battlefields until the world changed, and the age of the mounted warrior monk faded into history. Deep beneath the vaulted ceilings of Malbork's scriptorium, scribes once penned history in ink and blood, but not all their secrets were meant to survive. Among the most tantalizing gaps in the Teutonic Knights' legacy is the vanished Chronicle of Prussia, a manuscript rumored to contain truth so explosive it was scrubbed from the record. Written by the order's own priests in the 14th century, this chronicle allegedly detailed everything from secret treaties with pagan chieftains to the knights' unspoken alliances with rival Christian powers. Yet by the 16th century, it had disappeared without a trace. Some historians believe it was deliberately destroyed during the Reformation, its pages burned to hide evidence of the order's political machinations. Others whisper that it still exists, hidden in the crypt of a forgotten church or buried beneath the rubble of a collapsed castle, a medieval Da Vinci Code waiting to be unearthed. Then there's the enigma of the Amber Room, a treasure so lavish, it's often called the eighth wonder of the world. While most associate its disappearance with Nazi looting in World War II, few realize its origins trace back to the Teutonic Knights. Prussia's amber monopoly made the order fabulously wealthy, and archival fragments suggest they commissioned panels of carved amber as diplomatic gifts. One such masterpiece, gifted to a Russian Tsar in the early 18th century, became the nucleus of the legendary Amber Room, but here's the twist: Knights records mention two such creations. The second smaller panel adorned with Teutonic heraldry vanished during the Livonian War. Treasure hunters still comb the Baltic coast, convinced it lies sealed in a lost crypt beneath Königsberg's ruins. Even the order's relics hold dark intrigue. Malbork's treasury once housed sacred objects like the Sword of St. Maurice, a blade said to have dripped holy oil when wielded in battle. Yet after Tannenberg, it too disappeared. Some claim Polish knights smuggled it to Krakow as a trophy, while others insist it was melted down to pay mercenaries during the 13 Years' War. The truth, its final resting place might be closer than anyone thinks. In 2019, ground-penetrating radar detected an anomaly beneath the chapel of a remote Polish monastery, a metal object matching the sword's dimensions. But the church has refused excavations, citing spiritual sensitivities. Perhaps the most haunting mystery is the so-called Black Psalter, a prayer book bound in human skin. According to a 15th-century Livonian chronicler, the Psalter was crafted from the hide of a rebel Prussian chieftain, its pages inscribed with curses against the knight's enemies. Last seen in a Riga cathedral before the Livonian War, its whereabouts are unknown, though urban legends claim it surfaces during times of crisis. In 1841, a Nazi officer reportedly found it in a Latvian bunker and died within days, his journal filled with frantic scribbles about voices in the walls. These gaps in history aren't just missing puzzle pieces, they're deliberate shadows. The Teutonic Order understood the power of controlling narratives, of erasing what didn't serve their legend. Yet secrets have a way of resurfacing, whether it's a crumbling parchment found in a German attic or a glint of amber in a farmer's field, the knight's hidden past still whispers to those willing to listen. And somewhere in the space between myth and record, the truth waits. While the Teutonic Knights dominate history books, their sister order remains one of medieval Europe's best-kept secrets. The sisters of the Teutonic Order didn't wield swords or command castles, yet without them, the Knights' empire would have collapsed long before Tannenberg. These women were the hidden architects of the Order's success, running hospitals that doubled as diplomatic hubs and managing supply networks that stretched from Acre to Riga. In an era when monastic life often meant silence and seclusion, the sisters broke the mold, negotiating with merchants, overseeing vast estates, and even advising grandmasters behind closed doors. Take their hospital at Acre, where the order first took root. While knights fought on the ramparts, sisters like Mechthild von Sayn transformed their infirmary into a cross-cultural lifeline. Muslim and Christian patients received equal care, an unthinkable act of compassion in the Holy War's fevered climate. Chroniclers recorded how Arab physicians would secretly share medical knowledge with the sisters under truce flags, forging bonds that sometimes softened the war's brutality. This wasn't just charity, it was strategic brilliance. By positioning themselves as healers rather than conquerors, the sisters gained access to markets and intelligence networks closed to their armored brethren. Back in Prussia, their influence grew even more striking. At the fortress of Elbing, Sister Hildegard von Osterode didn't just supervise the sick, she commanded a workforce of 300. Her ledgers, preserved in fragments, reveal a staggering operation: fields producing grain for armies, beehives yielding wax for candles in every Teutonic chapel, even forges repairing knights' armor. When rebellions cut off supply lines, it was often the sisters who brokered deals with local Prussian women to smuggle food through enemy lines. Their convents became neutral ground where pagan and Christian women traded not just goods but grievances, subtly shaping the order's policies through whispered counsel. The most extraordinary twist: some sisters took up arms in all but name. During the Great Prussian Uprising of 1260, when pagan forces surrounded Marienwerder, the convent's prioress, Jutta von Sangerhausen, organized its defense. Though forbidden to wield swords, she trained her sisters in archery loophole in their vows, and directed cauldrons of boiling oil to be poured from the walls. For 3 weeks they held the fortress until reinforcements arrived. When the Grand Master demanded an explanation for such unorthodox tactics, Jutta reportedly presented him with a list of every knight whose life her sisters had saved. The reprimand never came. By the 15th century, their power began to wane as the Church tightened control over female religious orders, yet traces of their legacy endure. In Vienna's Deutschordenskirche, a faded fresco shows an unnamed sister standing beside a Grand Master, her hand resting on a ledger instead of a Bible, a silent testament to the women who balance the books of an empire built by men. Their story forces us to reconsider medieval gender roles, not as ironclad rules, but as boundaries constantly tested by those who refuse to be confined by them. The Teutonic sisters prove history's most fascinating figures often wielded scrolls, not swords, and that sometimes the quietest hands shape the mightiest kingdoms. The shadow of the Teutonic Knights stretches far beyond history books. It looms in opera houses, flickers across computer screens, and even pulses through modern nationalist rhetoric. Richard Wagner's Tannhäuser might seem like an unlikely place to start, but this 19th-century opera reveals how deeply the knights had embedded themselves in the German imagination. Wagner reshaped their image entirely, portraying them as mystic guardians of purity in his Venusberg scene, where the knight Tannhäuser is torn between earthly desire and the order's call to holy discipline. Never mind that the real Teutonic Knights had more to do with tax ledgers than Arthurian romance. Wagner's romanticized version became cultural canon, fueling the myth of Germanic knights as incorruptible champions. That myth would later be twisted into something far darker, but for now, it cemented the order's place in art as much as in war. Jump to the 21st century, and you'll find their legacy alive in places Wagner never imagined. The Crusader Kings video game series lets players rewrite history, plotting the knights' conquests with a few mouse clicks. Here, they're not just pixels, they're a force to be reckoned with, their black cross banners fluttering as players wage holy war across digital Prussia. Paradox Interactive, the game's developer, didn't just copy textbook history, they captured the order's ruthless pragmatism. Will you play as a pious grandmaster, forging alliances with the Pope, or will you betray your vows, seizing power for yourself? The game's brilliance lies in showing how the knight system was equal parts faith and cold calculation, something modern audiences grasp intuitively when they're the ones signing the orders. Yet this legacy isn't just entertainment. In Poland and Lithuania, the Teutonic Knights never fully shed their role as historical villains. Schoolchildren learn about Grunwald not just as a battle, but as a national founding myth, the moment when Slavs and Balts united against a common oppressor. Paintings like Machko's The Battle of Grunwald depict the knights not as holy warriors, but as faceless invaders, their helmets obscuring cruelty. This narrative isn't neutral, it's political fuel. When Lithuania's capital, Vilnius, erected a monument to Grand Duke Vytautas in 2010, it wasn't just commemorating a medieval ruler, it was quietly reaffirming a 700-year-old resistance story. The knights unwittingly became the foil against which modern identities were sharpened. Even their architecture whispers through pop culture. Malbork Castle's towering red bricks inspired the grim fortresses in the Witcher series, where monsters lurk in shadowed halls, a fitting metaphor for how history remembers the Order. And in Germany, their heraldry resurfaces in unexpected places, from beer labels to heavy metal album art, a symbol that's been stripped of its past and repurposed as raw aesthetic. The irony, the real Teutonic Knights would hardly recognize themselves in any of these incarnations. They've become less a historical reality than a canvas painted with nationalism, romanticism, or whatever narrative needs a convenient knight in shining or tarnished armor. Perhaps that's the most enduring power of their legacy, whether as Wagner's tortured saints, a gamer's pawns, or a nationalist scapegoat. The Teutonic Knights refuse to fade into the past. They linger instead in the stories we tell about ourselves, about heroism, tyranny, and the messy truth that history is never just what happened, it's what we choose to remember and what we can't afford to forget. The Teutonic Knights didn't just conquer with swords, they built an empire with ledgers. Behind every fortress and crusade lay a financial machine so sophisticated, it would make modern bankers blush. Their wealth didn't come from plunder alone, it flowed from a network of trade routes, loans, and monopolies that turned them into medieval power brokers. While history remembers their battles, the real secret to their dominance was their ability to turn piety into profit, and they did it with a system that rivaled even the mighty Hanseatic League. Take their control of the Baltic grain trade. Prussia's fertile plains produced harvests so abundant, the knights could feed entire cities for a price. Every bushel shipped down the Vistula River to Gdansk passed through their customs houses, where officials collected tolls with ruthless efficiency, but the knights didn't just tax trade, they weaponized it. When rebellious cities like Danzig tried to bypass their control, the Order simply blocked the river, starving their enemies into submission without drawing a single sword. This wasn't just commerce, it was economic warfare. Their banking operations were even bolder. Kings across Europe, from cash-strapped monarchs in Hungary to war-torn rulers in Bohemia, turned to the Teutonic treasury for loans. The Order's vaults in Marienburg held not just gold but IOUs from half the crowned heads of Christendom, and these weren't simple transactions, they were political masterstrokes. When King Wenceslaus of Bohemia defaulted on his debt, the knights extracted concessions that gave them control of key silver mines, shifting the balance of power without a drop of bloodshed. Perhaps most revolutionary was their use of comture bonds, an early form of medieval investment. Wealthy merchants and nobles could deposit funds with the Order, earning interest paid in amber, grain, or even crusading indulgences. These bonds doubled as loyalty tools. A German baron with money tied up in Prussia was far less likely to support the Order's enemies. It was a financial web so intricate, even the Vatican occasionally borrowed from their system. Yet the Knights' greatest economic coup was their amber monopoly. The Baltic coast held the world's richest deposits of this, gold of the north, and the Order controlled every step, from harvesting the raw resin to carving it into rosaries and reliquaries for Europe's elite. Their agents policed the beaches, executing anyone caught smuggling. Amber became currency, diplomacy, and propaganda all at once. A single carved necklace could buy a nobleman's allegiance or secure a papal favor, proving that wealth wasn't just about coins, it was about influence. For all their military might, the Teutonic Knights understood something timeless. True power flows through trade routes and tally sticks as much as through siege engines. Their financial acumen let them outlast defeats by allies and build an empire that endured long after their swords rusted. The lesson in the Game of Thrones: gold is often the sharpest blade. The Teutonic Knights' ambitions weren't confined to the Baltic. They cast their gaze southward, where the crumbling remnants of the Byzantine Empire promised both glory and loot. In the early 14th century, the order embarked on a disastrous series of Mediterranean campaigns that would expose the limits of their power. Their first misstep came in Armenia, where King Leo IV invited them to defend his kingdom against Mamluks and Turkoman raiders. The Knights seized the opportunity, establishing a foothold at the fortress of Roch de Roissel in 1307, but this wasn't Prussia. The arid mountains of Cilicia offered no familiar supply lines, no network of loyal settlers. Instead, they faced a population deeply skeptical of Latin crusaders, their loyalty torn between Armenian kings and rival factions. Within a decade, the Knights found themselves besieged not by Muslims, but by their own supposed allies. Armenian nobles, tired of their heavy-handed rule and confiscation of lands, turned on them. By 1320, the order was expelled, their dream of a Mediterranean outpost reduced to rubble and bitter recriminations. Greece would prove an even costlier blunder when the Catalan Company, a mercenary army run amok, seized the Duchy of Athens in 1311. The desperate Latin rulers turned to the Teutonic Knights for salvation. The order saw a chance to carve out a new principality under their Black Cross, sending knights to occupy key fortresses like Thebes, but they underestimated the chaos of Byzantine politics. Local Greek archons, already wary of Catholic rule, resented the Knights' attempts to impose Prussian-style governance. Worse still, the Catalans weren't mere bandits. They were battle-hardened veterans who'd fought from Sicily to Constantinople. When clashes erupted, the Knights discovered their famed heavy cavalry was useless in Greece's narrow mountain passes. The Catalans, masters of guerrilla warfare, picked them apart in ambushes. By 1324, the order was forced to abandon Attica, their Greek adventure ending in humiliation. What made these failures so telling wasn't just the defeats themselves, but what they revealed about the order's inflexibility. In Prussia, the Knights had mastered a specific formula: fortress networks, German colonization, and papal backing, but transplanting that model to the Mediterranean, where cultures clashed and loyalties shifted like sand, proved impossible. In Armenia, they alienated local Christians by treating them as subjects rather than allies. In Greece, they misread the political landscape, assuming brute force could overcome centuries of Byzantine intrigue. Even their famed discipline worked against them. Commanders rigidly adhered to tactics that had won Baltic battles but crumbled in Anatolian heat or Peloponnesian ravines. The Mediterranean misadventures left scars deeper than lost battles. They drained the order's coffers, diverting resources from their Baltic heartland just as new threats like Lithuania emerged. More damningly, they eroded the Knights' aura of invincibility. European patrons who'd once bankrolled their crusades now questioned their judgment. When the Grand Master begged for funds to reclaim Armenian outposts, even the Pope hesitated. The lesson was clear: the Teutonic Order wasn't an unstoppable force, but a regional power with fatal blind spots. Their strength lay in the frozen north, not the sun-baked hills of the Mediterranean. And as their ambitions shrank back to Prussia, so too did their reputation as Christendom's unwavering sword. The Teutonic Knights never fought alone. Their empire was built on a web of alliances as fragile as they were strategic. Take their on-again, off-again partnership with Denmark, a relationship that swung between brotherhood and betrayal. When King Valdemar II sought to Christianize Estonia in 1200, he gladly accepted the Knights' swords, only to watch in horror as they claimed the conquered lands for themselves. Decades later, the Danes returned the favor by backing Prussian rebels during the Great Uprising, funneling weapons to pagan tribes just to weaken their opportunistic allies. This was the dance of medieval power. Today's benefactor could become tomorrow's saboteur with the stroke of a pen. Hungary's King Andrew II learned this lesson the hard way. He'd invited the Knights to defend Transylvania's borders in 1225. granting them sweeping autonomy, but within years, their fortresses loomed over Hungarian lands like a growing shadow. When Andrew discovered they'd secretly petitioned the Pope to make their territory independent of his crown, his response was swift and merciless. The knights were expelled in 1225, their castles seized overnight. Their first attempt at state building ended in disgrace, proving even holy warriors couldn't outmaneuver seasoned monarchs. No rivalry burned hotter than their feud with the Templars. Though both were crusading orders, their visions clashed violently. The Templars dismissed the Teutonic Knights as upstarts, mocking their German roots and provincial ambitions. When the Teutonic Order sought control of Acre's German quarter, the Templars blocked them at every turn, even allegedly poisoning a Grand Master during negotiations in 1271. The animosity grew so toxic that during the siege of Acre in 1291, witnesses reported the two orders refusing to coordinate defenses, choosing annihilation over cooperation. The Templars' eventual destruction brought the Knights no joy, only a chilling reminder that no order, no matter how powerful, was immune to downfall. Yet the Knights' most surprising alliance was with pagan Lithuania, the very nation that would later destroy them at Grunwald. For nearly a century, Lithuania's rulers played a double game, publicly feuding with the Order while secretly negotiating land swaps and prisoner exchanges. Grand Duke Vytautas even invited Teutonic commanders to his christening in 1386, using their presence to legitimize his conversion while plotting their eventual ruin. The lesson was clear: in the Baltic's shifting sands, even sworn enemies could become temporary partners when gold or glory demanded it. These tangled relationships reveal the Knights' true genius. They understood politics as another battlefield. Every handshake hid a dagger, every treaty carried an expiration date. Their ability to pivot between ally and adversary kept them afloat for centuries, proving that in the Game of Thrones, faith was just another bargaining chip. The white mantle of the Teutonic Knights wasn't just a uniform, it was a manifesto woven in fabric. Every thread carried meaning, from the snowy purity symbolizing their Marian devotion to the stark black cross declaring their unyielding faith. To understand the power of that cloak, you have to step into the medieval mindset, where colors weren't just decorative, they were divine. White, the hue of the Virgin Mary's innocence, transformed each knight into a walking shrine, a living testament to their heavenly patroness. When they rode into battle, that mantle billowed like a war banner, proclaiming they fought under celestial protection. Even the cross's angular simplicity held hidden significance. Its straight lines mirrored the swords of Christian martyrs, while its blackness stood as a warning. This was no ordinary brotherhood, but God's chosen warriors. But the mantle's magic went deeper than symbolism. Chronicles tell of knights wearing these cloaks into battle without a single drop of blood staining the fabric, miraculous proof, they claimed, of Mary's favor. During the siege of Christmamel in 1333, a Teutonic chaplain swore he saw an arrow stop mid-air before piercing a knight's mantle, as if repelled by invisible hands. Such stories weren't just propaganda, they were psychological warfare. Pagan enemies whispered that these white-clad warriors bore charmed lives, their very clothing woven with divine power. The Order cultivated this mystique deliberately. New recruits received their mantles in ceremonies dripping with sacred theater, the cloth blessed by bishops, sprinkled with holy water, and even pressed against relics of the true cross. To don the mantle was to become something more than human, an instrument of heaven's will, yet the cloak's prestige masked a darker duality. That same sanctified fabric could become a shroud. Knights mortally wounded in battle were often wrapped in their own mantles before burial, the bloodstains left untouched as evidence of martyrdom. In Malbork's crypts, archaeologists found skeletons still clad in tattered white, the black crosses now faded to gray, silent witnesses to the Order's central paradox. They were both healers and conquerors, their robes as much a reminder of their Hospitaller origins as a badge of martial supremacy. even the grandest ceremonies couldn't hide the stains beneath the symbolism. When Grand Master Winrich von Nipperode processed through Marienburg, his pristine mantle trailed over floors polished by serf labor and paid for with amber extracted under the lash. The white cloth proclaimed purity, but the hands that wore it were never clean. By the Reformation, that sacred aura had dulled. Lutheran satirists mocked the mantles as ghost sheets, accusing the knights of hiding corruption behind holy theater. When secularization came, the cloaks were stripped away like old theater curtains, revealing an order that had long since traded divine mandate for earthly power. Yet even in mothballed obscurity, the white mantle retained its grip on imagination. Napoleon, upon seeing a Teutonic relic cloak in Berlin, reportedly murmured, "Such a small thing to make men kneel for centuries." Today reproductions hang in museums, their crosses now historical curiosities rather than battle standards, but stand before one long enough, and you might still feel the echo of what they once represented, not just cloth and thread, but the terrifying, thrilling belief that mortal men could wear the armor of the divine. The forests of Kurland burned with a fury that matched the anger of its people, while the Teutonic Knights celebrated their victories in Prussia. The Curonian tribes of modern-day Latvia refused to bow. These weren't disorganized raiders, they were masters of asymmetric warfare, turning their homeland's dense woodlands and boggy marshes into deadly traps. In 1272, when the knights pushed into Curonian lands expecting another swift conquest, they walked into a nightmare. Villages stood eerily empty, their granaries and homes already torched by their own inhabitants. The message was clear: if the invaders wanted this land, they'd claim nothing but ashes. What made the Curonians so formidable was their intimate knowledge of the wilderness. Their warriors moved like ghosts through the pine forests, using bird calls to coordinate ambushes. One knight's chronicle describes an entire patrol vanishing near Kuldiga, 70 men swallowed by the mist, their corpses later found pinned to trees with wooden stakes. The Curonians didn't fight for glory, they fought to make occupation unbearable. When knights garrisoned a captured fort, they'd wake to find their water sources poisoned with rotting carcasses. Supply wagons disappeared without a trace, their drivers left hanging from branches as grim warnings. The climax came during the Great Curonian Revolt of 1290. After years of simmering resistance, chieftains like Nemesis united the tribes in a coordinated uprising. They struck at night, simultaneously attacking half a dozen Teutonic outposts. At Dobel Castle, rebels disguised as peasant laborers smuggled in weapons, then slaughtered the garrison during a feast. Along the Venter River, Curonian boats ambushed Crusader ships, their archers firing from concealed reed beds. The knights retaliated with brutal reprisals, burning sacred groves, executing hostages, but each atrocity only fueled the rebellion. By 1297, the order faced a sobering truth. They'd poured blood and gold into Kurland for 25 years, yet controlled little beyond their crumbling forts. The Curonians couldn't win pitched battles, but they didn't need to. Their resistance proved that faith and steel weren't enough to conquer a people who'd rather burn their world than surrender it. In the end, the knights abandoned outright conquest, opting for uneasy truces that left the tribes nominally Christian but fiercely independent. The lesson echoed across the Baltic: some fires once lit could never be fully extinguished. Even the most disciplined brotherhoods have their moments of chaos, and the Teutonic Knights were no exception. Behind the gleaming armor and pious vows, their history hides dark chapters of internal purges where accusations of heresy and treason tore through their ranks like wildfire. One of the most shocking scandals erupted in the late 14th century, when whispers of sodomy and devil worship began swirling around the inner circle of Grand Master Winrich von Nipperode. This wasn't just gossip, it was a calculated power play, where faith became a weapon and loyalty meant nothing if it stood in the way of ambition. The drama unfolded in the shadowy corridors of Marienburg Castle, where von Niprod's rivals suddenly found themselves facing charges that could mean execution. The accusations were explosive: secret rituals, unholy oaths, even rumors that certain knights had renounced Christ in hidden ceremonies. Trials were swift and brutal, with confessions extracted under methods the order preferred not to document. One knight, Heinrich von Plauen, no relation to the later Grand Master, was stripped of his rank after witnesses claimed they'd seen him engaging in acts so scandalous, scribes could only allude to them as sins against nature. Another, Gerhard von Schwarzburg, vanished entirely from records after being accused of conspiring with pagan sorcerers. Their fates remain mysterious, but the message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. What makes these trials so revealing isn't just their brutality, but their hypocrisy. The same order that presented itself as Christendom's purest defenders was perfectly willing to destroy its own with the very heresy laws meant for pagans. Historians now believe many of these accusations were fabrications, orchestrated by von Niprod to eliminate challengers to his authority. The timing was suspicious. The trials peaked just as the Grand Master faced criticism over costly campaigns in Lithuania. Suddenly, his loudest critics found themselves on trial, their reputations shredded by the same institution they'd sworn to serve, yet the scandals backfired in ways no one anticipated. The trials left deep scars in the order's morale, breeding paranoia among the ranks. Knights began eyeing each other with suspicion, wondering who might next wield the Bible as a blade. Worse still, the Church took notice. When papal investigators arrived to probe the allegations, they left with troubling questions about whether the order had lost its way. A brotherhood founded on sacred vows now stood accused of violating the very principles it claimed to defend. The fallout lingered for decades, a stain no amount of holy water could wash away. These purges expose a grim truth about power: even the most righteous causes can rot from within. The Teutonic Knights had spent centuries casting themselves as God's chosen warriors, but in the shadows of Marienburg, they proved no less ruthless than the secular lords they scorned. Their heresy trials weren't about piety, they were about control, and the price of defiance was your name, your honor, and sometimes your life. Smoke curled over the battlements of Marienburg as the last Teutonic stronghold braced for its reckoning. 13 years of war had reduced Prussia to ruins, and now, in the bitter winter of 1457, Polish forces closed their iron grip around the order's crimson fortress. Inside those walls, Grand Master Heinrich Reuss von Plauen faced an impossible choice: surrender the heart of his empire, or watch his men starve to death. The siege wasn't just a battle, it was the death rattle of a theocratic state that had once made kings tremble. The Polish army, led by King Casimir IV, knew Marienburg's weaknesses better than the knights themselves. Prussian defectors had revealed hidden passages, while Hanseatic merchants, tired of the order's heavy taxes, smuggled Polish sappers into position. As cannons pounded the outer walls day and night, the knights' legendary discipline began to crack. Chroniclers tell of desperate sorties where starving warriors, their white mantles now ragged and soot-stained, fought with the frenzy of condemned men, not for victory, but for the slim chance of dying sword in hand rather than succumbing to hunger. One moment captures the siege's brutal poetry. When Polish forces breached the lower bailey, the knights unleashed their last secret weapon: boiling pitch stored in the castle's foundry. The screams of scalded attackers echoed through the courtyards, but the victory was hollow. With supplies cut off, even molten death couldn't stop the inevitable. By June, rats had become a luxury. A knight's diary from the final weeks survives, its pages stained with blood and candle wax. We eat belt leather now. The horses went weeks ago. God forgive us, some talk of the fallen. The end came not with a climactic assault, but through betrayal. A group of mercenaries, unpaid for months, smuggled Polish troops through the mill gate under cover of darkness. As dawn broke on June 7th, von Plauen stood atop the high castle's tower, watching the Polish banner rise over the city. The terms of surrender were shockingly lenient. The knights could leave with their lives and personal arms, but Marienburg and its treasures belonged to Poland. As the last Teutonic soldiers marched out, their black cross banners dragged in the mud, Prussian women spat at their feet. What made this defeat so crushing wasn't just the loss of a castle, it was the shattering of a sacred myth. For 2 centuries, the knights had claimed God himself willed their rule. Now, as Polish priests held Mass in Marienburg's chapel, the truth was undeniable: divine favor had switched sides. The order would linger on as a rump state, but its golden age was over. The bricks of Marienburg, forged in Prussian blood and Baltic amber, now bore the scars of a lesson every empire learns too late: no walls are high enough to withstand the weight of tyranny's consequences. The Teutonic Knights left a legacy as complex as the tangled forests of Prussia. They once conquered a duality that still sparks debate centuries later. On one hand, they were undeniably pious warriors, men who traded earthly comforts for a life of prayer and battle in service to their faith. Their hospitals healed the sick even as their swords struck down pagans. Their scriptoriums preserved sacred texts, while their armies burned rebellious villages. This was the paradox at their core: a brotherhood capable of profound charity and chilling brutality, often within the same breath. Yet to paint them solely as holy crusaders ignores the colonial machine they built. Their conquests weren't just about converting souls, they were about controlling land, trade, and people with the precision of a merchant and the ruthlessness of a warlord. The Prussian tribes they subjugated didn't vanish. They became serfs in their own homeland, their languages suppressed, their traditions erased under the guise of salvation. The amber that funded Malbork's towering walls wasn't gathered by knights, but by hands bound to the order's estates. This wasn't just a holy war, it was an empire built on extraction. Perhaps the most haunting question isn't whether they were defenders or conquerors, but whether those roles were ever truly separate. When papal emissaries praised their victories, were they applauding faith or expansion? When merchants paid their tolls, were they funding crusades or profiteering? Even their greatest admirers couldn't ignore the contradictions. A 14th century chronicler once wrote of the knights, "They pray like monks, trade like Venetians, and conquer like Romans," a trio of identities that never quite reconciled. So where does that leave us? The ruins of their castles still stand, their red bricks weathered but unbroken, much like the debates they inspire. Were they the last true knights of Christendom, or the first colonialists of Europe? The answer might lie not in choosing a side, but in holding both truths at once: that faith and empire were never separate games, but 2 moves in the same eternal struggle for power. Now we turn it over to you. When you look at the Black Cross, do you see a holy symbol or a brand of conquest? Drop your thoughts below, and let's keep the debate alive.